You know, people always say that buying your dream home is supposed to be the start of a new chapter, a fresh beginning where everything is peaceful. But for me, it felt more like I'd accidentally stepped onto a landmine the second my boots hit the gravel of my new driveway. I'd spent nearly a decade saving every cent, working double shifts in the city, just so I could finally afford a slice of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place called Timberline Creek, where the air smells like damp pine, and the only neighbors you're supposed to worry about are the black bears and the occasional curious deer. I remember the feeling of that last moving box hitting the floor of my cabin, that heavy thud of accomplishment, and I was literally just standing there, sweat on my forehead and dust on my jeans, looking out at the sunset through my new porch windows when the first knock came. It wasn't Oppo's, a friendly neighborly tap. Either it was that sharp, rhythmic pounding that immediately tells you someone on the other side of the door thinks they own the air you're breathing. I opened it to find 3 people standing there like a makeshift firing squad, led by a woman who looked like she'd been born wearing a visor and holding a clipboard, her eyes hidden behind those oversized, reflective sunglasses that make you feel like you're talking to a bug. She didn't even offer a quote, welcome to the neighborhood, quote, or a quote, hello, quote. She just pointed a manicured finger toward my truck, which was tucked neatly off the dirt road, and barked that I couldn't and Oppo's. Park on, quote, common HOA property, quote. I just blinked at her, still holding a roll of packing tape, and tried to be polite. Told her my name was Silas, and that I'd literally just moved in, but she cut me off before I could even finish my sentence. She told me her name was Brenda, the president of the Timberline Creek HOA, and that she didn't care who I was because my Chevy was violating the slope ordinance. My cabin's roof was a shade of, quote, forest green, quote, that hadn't an Oppo's. Been approved by the aesthetic committee, and my wooden porch swing was a, quote, non-conforming structure, quote, that had to go by Friday. I stood there leaning against the doorframe, watching her 2 sidekicks, a guy in a polo shirt who was already taking photos of my house, and a woman scribbling notes like she was recording a crime scene, and I just couldn't and Oppo's. Helped but laugh because it was so surreal, so utterly ridiculous. I told Brenda that this cabin had been standing here for 30 years, long before her little committee probably even existed, and she just snapped her clipboard shut with a sound like a gunshot, telling me that if it was built 30 years ago, then it was built illegally because there was no record of it in the HOA registry. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I didn't hand over my land usage documents and tear down that swing by the weekend, they'd start issuing fines that wouldn't, quote, make my mortgage look like pocket change, quote. And that really should have been a moment I got angry, but instead, I just felt this strange, calm ripple of satisfaction. I asked her if she was absolutely sure she wanted to start this fight on day one, and she just narrowed those hidden eyes and asked if that was a threat. So I gave her a little half smile and told her it wasn't Oppo's threat, it was a spoiler. See, the thing Brenda didn't know, the thing she couldn't and Oppo's, Tia possibly guessed in her wildest, power-tripping dreams, was that I hadn't and Oppo's. T just bought a cabin on a hill. I had spent the last 8 months quietly navigating a legal labyrinth to buy out the entire defunct development company that originally owned the land. I wasn't just a new resident. I was technically the person who owned the ground her HOA office was sitting on, but I wasn't in Oppo's. T ready to give away the ending just yet. I watched them march off down my driveway, looking so proud of themselves, and I just went back inside, sat down at my kitchen table amongst the half-unpacked boxes, and pulled out a thick, blue folder labeled, quote, Timberline Holdings Group, LLC, quote. I spent that first night not sleeping, but spreading out maps across the floor, old survey data from the late 80s and county records that had been gathering dust in a basement for decades, because I knew the history of this place better than anyone living here. The property lines in Timberline Creek had shifted during a massive bankruptcy in the 90s, and when the original developers bailed, they left behind a mess of, quote, common areas, quote, that the HOA just assumed they inherited by default, but the paperwork I held said otherwise. I was looking at satellite overlays that showed Brenda's precious, quote, common slope, quote, was actually part of my deeded parcel. And even more interesting, the community's main access trail and half the swimming pond were sitting on land that the HOA had never legally secured. The next morning, I headed into the county seat, A sleepy little town where the air smells like wood smoke and old paper, and I sat down with a clerk named Mr. Henderson who'd been there since the dawn of time. When I showed him my transfer certificate and my ID, he let out this long, low whistle, pushed his glasses up his nose, and told me that I was about to, end quote, rattle every cage in the valley, end quote, because the folks at Timberline had been acting like they were the kings of the mountain for 20 years without a single valid deed to back them up. I walked out of there with a manila envelope so heavy it felt like a weapon, containing certified copies of the parcel boundaries and a very specific zoning variance for 1994 that Brenda had told me didn't oppose to exist, and I felt a bit like a ghost hunter who had finally found the bodies buried under the floorboards. When I got home, I found a yellow notice taped to my front door, not handwritten, but printed in a cold, blocky font, titled, end quote, Mandatory Compliance Order, end quote, listing everything from my, end quote, unauthorized roofing material, end quote, to the fact that I hadn't, and oppose, trimmed the weeds near the road, which they claimed was a fire hazard. At the bottom, it demanded a $400 fine payable within 72 hours, or they would, end quote, initiate a lien process, end quote, against my property, and that was the moment I stopped being amused and started being focused. I didn't, and oppose, call Brenda, and I didn't, and oppose, go to the HOA office. Instead, I made 3 very specific phone calls, the first to the county assessor to request a formal site inspection, the second to a land use attorney named Sarah, who is known for being the kind of legal shark that makes people wake up in a cold sweat, and the third to the local sheriff's department, just to put them on notice that I was being harassed. Sarah laughed when I told her about the fines, her voice crackling over the phone as she told me that trying to enforce aesthetic codes on a structure that predates the HOA's charter is basically, end quote, legal suicide, end quote, and she promised me a cease and desist letter by the afternoon that would be, end quote, the legal equivalent of a sledgehammer, end quote. But while the lawyers were doing their thing, I decided to do a little field research of my own, so I set up a few motion trigger trail cameras along the back tree line where my property meets the, end quote, common forest, end quote, because I had a feeling Brenda's, end quote, hit squad, end quote, wasn't, in oppose, done with me yet. Sure enough, just after dusk on Wednesday, my phone pinged with an alert, and I watched in grainy infrared as 2 figures in dark hoodies, one of them clearly carrying a can of spray paint, hiked up the trail toward my tool shed. They didn't, in oppose, see the camera, and they definitely didn't, in oppose, see me watching them from the darkened window of my kitchen as they sprayed a massive neon orange, end quote, X, end quote, across the side of my shed and pinned yet another, end quote, final notice, end quote, to the door. The next morning, I didn't, in oppose, washed the paint off. I just took high-resolution photos, printed them out, and drove straight to the sheriff's office to meet with a deputy named Miller, who looked like he'd dealt with HOA drama one too many times. He looked at the photos, saw the hooded figure with the distinct HOA-branded windbreaker peeking out from under the hoodie, and just shook his head, telling me that this was felony vandalism and trespassing, and asking if I wanted to press charges. I told him I'd hold off on the handcuffs for today, but I wanted a formal report filed because I was building a case that was going to end their little reign of terror once and for all. When I got back to the cabin, there was Brenda standing on the edge of the road with her clipboard, looking at the orange, end quote, X, end quote, on my shed with this smug, satisfied expression, and I just rolled down my window as I pulled past her and told her she'd forgotten to wear her hood last night. Her face went from smug to ghostly white in about 3 seconds, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but she didn't, in oppose, say a word as I drove by and parked my truck right back on that slope she hated so much. By Friday morning, Sarah had delivered the goods, and I wasn't, in oppose, just holding a cease and desist. I was holding the results of a deep dive audit into the HOA's incorporation papers. It turns out that while they'd been collecting dues and issuing fines for 2 decades, they had never actually registered their, end quote, enforcement authority, end quote, with the state, which meant every single fine they'd ever collected was technically a fraudulent transaction. Not only that, but Brenda had been funneling the, end quote, maintenance fees, end quote, into a private account registered to a shell company owned by her brother, a company that hadn't, in oppose, mowed a single lawn or cleared a single trail in 10 years. I decided it was time for a little community meeting, but not the kind Brenda liked to run, so I went for a walk around the neighborhood, stopping to talk to people like Old Man Miller down the road and a young couple, Elias and Maya, who were living in a beautiful A-frame further up the ridge. I found out that Brenda had been terrorizing them too, threatening to sue Elias because he'd built a small vegetable garden in his backyard, and telling Maya she couldn't into oppos. To have her therapy dog because it exceeded the weight limit for pets, which wasn't in oppos, even in the bylaws. As I listened to their stories of intimidation, of people being forced to pay thousands in fake fees just to keep their homes, I realized this wasn't oppos. Just about my cabin or my land anymore. It was about a group of bullies who had turned a beautiful mountain community into their own private fiefdom. I invited a few of the most violated neighbors over to my porch that Saturday, and I laid out the maps, the deeds, and the legal findings, and you could have heard a pin drop as they realized the common land they'd been told was off limits actually belonged to me, and that the HOA had no legal right to even exist in its current form. We decided to wait for the big annual compliance meeting that Brenda had scheduled for the following Tuesday at the community center, a small building that, according to my new deed, I now technically own the lease on. When Tuesday rolled around, the room was packed with nervous-looking residents, and Brenda was up at the front, standing behind a podium like she was the queen of the mountains, starting off the meeting by announcing that, certain new residents, were refusing to follow the rules and that, drastic measures, would be taken. That was my cue, so I stood up from the back of the room, walked slowly down the center aisle holding a thick stack of papers, and I didn't in oppos say a word until I was standing right in front of her podium. I handed her the cease and desist, the county assessor's report, and the audit of her brother's shell company, and I watched her face go through a dozen different emotions: confusion, anger, and finally sheer cold terror as she realized what she was looking at. I turned to the room and told everyone that the HOA they'd been paying for 20 years was a ghost, a fraud, and that the land they were standing on didn't and oppos belonged to the board, but to the holdings group I now controlled. The chaos that followed was like something out of a movie. People were shouting, Brenda was trying to scream over the noise that I was lying, but then Deputy Miller walked in the back door with a few state investigators, and the room went silent as they walked straight to the front and asked Brenda to step away from the podium. It wasn't in oppos just about the fines or the land. The state investigators had found that the fire mitigation funds, thousands of dollars meant to clear brush and create fire breaks to protect the valley, had been completely drained, leaving the entire community at risk of a catastrophic wildfire just to line Brenda's pockets. Watching her being escorted out in handcuffs while she screamed about, aesthetic integrity, was one of the most satisfying things I've ever seen, but the real work started after the sirens faded away. Over the next month, we dismantled the old HOA, returned the stolen funds to the residents, and I officially deeded the common areas, back to a new, volunteer-run community trust that actually cares about things like fire safety and neighborly help instead of roof colors and parking spots. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. The part that makes me wonder if justice is ever really as simple as we want it to be. After Brenda was sentenced and the dust settled, I found out that she hadn't into oppos. Started out as a villain. She'd been a resident who lost her own home to a forest fire years ago because a neighbor had been negligent, and she'd spent the rest of her life obsessed with, control, and, compliance, as a way to make sure it never happened again. She'd become the very monster she was trying to protect the community from. And even though the neighborhood is peaceful now, I see the way people look at me, the guy who owns the land, the guy who has the power to take it all away if I ever decided to become the new Brenda. It makes me wonder if every community eventually creates a tyrant, or if power just has a way of turning a dream into a cage, no matter who's holding the keys. So, I'm curious, if you found out your local leaders were breaking the law to, protect, would you want to know the truth even if it meant destroying the stability of your neighborhood? Or is a little bit of corruption worth the peace and quiet of a well-manicured lawn? Let me know what you think in the comments, because honestly, I'm still trying to figure out if I'm the hero of this story or just the new landlord everyone's afraid to cross. Don and Oppos, forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more about how I'm trying to rebuild Timberline Creek without becoming the next person with a clipboard and a vendetta.